Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. He was my classmate, he was not my professor. I want to clarify that. Uh, but it's a very auspicious day. We've got together on a day which in India we celebrate as Guru Purnima. In some way, it is a day of introspection. So I'm glad we are today gathered together to introspect on economic prosperity and hopefully prosperity of every kind. I'm not sure Raja and me and Sir can talk about prosperity up here, but I think we can talk about economic prosperity. Uh, we have entrepreneurs, thinkers on the panel. The 5 questions that I'd like the panel to address. One is, how do we define prosperity? How do we define economic prosperity? How do we define in the context of India? How do we define in the context of what's happening across the globe I mean, no offense meant to anyone, but when somebody like Donald Trump progresses, it in some way shows that there are people who are unhappy with the way capitalism has panned out. When Brexit happens, it only strengthens that feeling. So in the context of this widening gulf between haves and have-nots, what does economic prosperity mean to India? The last budget, uh, the last cabinet reshuffle, in some way, this government has tried to bring about a social change, whether in the kind of ministers they brought or the kind of budget. It was budget for the social sector. So really in this context, what does economic prosperity for India mean? Second, the role of governments. Third, this debate of big versus small. Many, when we were in the business school 23 years back, uh, we would talk about how growth and economic prosperity happens with lots of capital and labor. Today, capital is still needed, but technology in some way has replaced that labor. So how do you see these two factors contributing to? My fourth point that I'd like is, while we talk of economic prosperity, I think in this country, we're not talking of the social cost of economic prosperity. How do we focus on that? And last, again, our country is too focused on physical fitness, economic indicators. I think the countries that will rule the world, and India used to rule the world at many, many centuries back, are the countries that are softer powers, that are inclusive in terms of making sure everybody, that focus on the mind. Uh, how do we balance growth in other indicators of prosperity, which may not necessarily be economic, to be able to reach economic prosperity goals? So this is what I'd like the panel to focus. We'll start with you, Raja, and we'll go around the...
Hello. I'm Raja Chaudhary. I'm a filmmaker and a digital media producer. And I've been working in India for about 9 years now. Before this, I was in the States and in England. And one of the biggest difficulties is that as a creative, and especially if you want to create innovation and creative culture in India, the access to marketplace, the protection of intellectual properties, the getting past, being able to set up a company quickly, being able to understand how to incubate something. I was looking at a story recently where a group of entrepreneurs in Jammu and Ladakh are trying to come together to form incubators, and they're doing software, they're doing agricultural products, they're doing all kinds of things. They're trying to tap into the central union money, as we were talking about earlier, but they were finding that it had to go through Srinagar, the money to get to the Jammu incubator. And Srinagar was giving the money to Kashmiri entrepreneurs and Kashmiri things, and Jammu was not getting the money. And it was the same in Ladakh. And what we found was that all these young, educated, budding entrepreneurs in Ladakh and Leh are sitting there in these tier 2, tier 3 cities and unable to tap into markets, capital, legal structure, formation of companies, all these things that you naturally take for granted as an entrepreneur, And if you look at the other side, in other countries, disruptions have occurred, For example, if you made music, You know, in the States before, you had 5 big brands and they ran the music industry. Then what happened was that YouTube and iTunes come along and a disruption occurs, and now an entrepreneur, musician with a small budget can release a single and it can become a global success overnight, you know, literally. And in India, we have the same situation now where 5 major families or companies own 99% of the media of India, right, of the media. So the internet becomes a potential access disruptor for us to use to allow filmmakers, musicians to emerge from small towns anywhere and become famous, you know. And I think that we have a budding, I'm watching across this culture of startups coming all over the country and being stifled at the very early stages of trying to incubate themselves, you know. And what happens is that a lot of angels and venture capitalists are coming in and creating the buffer, allowing them to thrive a little bit because they know how to wiggle through the system. They know how to run the accounting, they know how to do the bookkeeping, they know how to...
So what is the point you're making, Raja?
So the point I'm making is that if the government can free up a tremendous amount of energy is there, bursting in creative energy, that can, and especially in the mind, you know, but we were talking about the mind, and that energy can burst out much more, you know, in terms of yoga entrepreneurs or musicians or artists or whatever you like. We are so capable in the mind in India. We just need now to educate the younger people how to tap into these, you know, tools and use them.
Raja, you made 3 broad points. You made the pertinent point to me when you talk of Kashmir. In some way, you bring about an area that has somehow not been touched by economic prosperity or got left behind for various reasons. So I think when we talk, we who live in Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, we're not fully comprehending the impact of social movements. Right, wrong is a different debate, you know. But I think today economic prosperity is going to be threatened by 20 people who are unhappy about something, who are not in the mainstream of benefiting from this economy. So I think that's the first point you make. Second point you make is that India still has a long way in terms of creating a environment which is like Silicon Valley, so to say. Third point you make is that entrepreneurship is not just about, you know, starting e-commerce companies, but, you know, creative entrepreneurship. And that also adds to the economic prosperity. In fact, there is a research which says the cities that patronize art well, the real estate prices in those cities are higher than anywhere else. So really the economic prosperity debate and the social quotient going high in terms of social development are in some way intertwined, and you focus on that. So coming to you, and you bring out an inside-outside perspective, you know. So we'd like you to give your opening remarks.
Well, I think this point he made about Kashmir is a fascinating thing. I don't see it as simply as a Kashmiri issue or anything. Why should money flow through Srinagar? That's a pure government distortion. The government of India and the Jammu and Kashmir government, they decided it has to go through Srinagar. That's a distortion of the worst kind. I think Shankar and I immediately will agree. Think about the distortion. This distortion instantly creates an uneven field between entrepreneurs in Jammu, creative entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs in Kashmir and the valley. This is probably one of the great examples of how in India entrepreneurship is stifled at the crib. and this should not be. And I think I would certainly sympathize with your view, because this is the kind of distortion we should eliminate. If we eliminate it, Indian creative entrepreneurs will compete more effectively, not only within India, they can actually compete.
But let me play contrary. It's an exception, it's not the norm. Today, entrepreneurship is thriving in India. So really, this may be an exception. This is not the norm in my view.
No. As a matter of fact, it's not strictly true. I used to be a banker in this country. As a State Bank of India manager, both in small-scale industries, large-scale industries, and international finance. And I can tell you how distortions are carried in the banking sector. You go to the bank manager, you have the right connections, you will get the loan faster.
Of course, that.
And if you have the government supporting, you will get it faster. the regular entrepreneur will have very little chance. This is the same thing. In other words, the state-owned banks, state-owned enterprises have themselves become a huge distorter in this marketplace.
Sure.
So essentially, everything we say, I said here, and Shankar said, we will agree on it. I think we are fully sympathetic with what you are saying.
Some people don't agree there.
These anti-competitive market distortions are largely created by the government to favor a few and disfavor a few others.
Just to kind of bring context, I would say this government is trying to be very meritocracy oriented, not encourage crony capital. I can't say that it'll get to zero. I mean, just look at the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana.
Please don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about
Yeah,
this
so
government.
I'm not.
India from
No, I'm not trying to put
1947.
in. Yeah, but you're right.
So please,
But
I'm not trying to
but
put this
I'm
government.
trying to bring the point that it is changing. The Prime Minister understands that for too long crony capitalism has created a divide. Yeah. So he's trying to make sure right from the budget, it is a budget that broadens the base of people who are recipients of this economic prosperity. Even if you look at the cabinet reshuffle, the kind of ministers that have been brought in. And again, you may see the effects of all this maybe in a year, maybe later.
No, you and I are actually in sync. As I mentioned in my statement, both the sectors which I pointed out, cotton garment sector as well as in the civil aviation sector, recent changes have been positive. They have made some very good moves. I completely applaud this government for eliminating some of the distortion. There's more distortions remain. All I'm hoping for, and I think Shankar would agree with me, we would like to have more of these distortions eliminated so the India can become more prosperous, it can be a more happier home for entrepreneurs, and a bigger job creating machine India will be. And that's, you and I are actually talking the same language. By the way, I have no specific favor, things against this government.
No, but generally, governments tend to be like that.
70 years of India, since India's independence, almost, I think 70, next year it will be 70. We've been struggling with this issue. So that's what I'm focusing on.
Anurag, may I read one point for 1 minute only? That I don't agree with the thesis that entrepreneurship is blossoming in India. Reason being is that the storytelling is stifled. We are not able, when the media is owned by a few groups, and 99%, let me just complete, 99% are not able to get stories out, to get media out, to talk, to distribute, to get to markets. It's impossible to do it.
See, that's another debate. And I don't agree with you there, but I won't, I think we have to focus on what we are here to discuss, which is economic prosperity. Where will be in 5 years? What does India need to do? The role of government, big versus small, the role of technology. I think just to do it, because that's a sector I know a little better than most, being an entrepreneur in the media space, having lost all my hair doing that, and dealing with people like
You look good for it.
Yeah. So I think, let me tell you, because of technology, today you don't need to be dependent on a big media company to be able to get your message out.
That was my point.
Yeah, so you don't need to be. I mean, let's look at our Prime Minister. He's reaching out to people directly. Look at his Twitter followers. Look at, so he knows that if he can reach out to them directly, of course, media tends to favor the governments in power. Let's also be clear about that. I'm not doubting that. But I'm saying today, there is a view. I mean, if there are 3 journalists that don't like the Prime Minister, there are 3 journalists that like the Prime Minister. So it all balances out. And I do not agree. Even if you look at in the US, large families, traditional business families own most of large traditional US mainstream media. So I don't think you can say that because of that, America is a worse off place. So first of all, I don't buy the fact that 99% of the Indian media is owned by a few. That's not true, and I have knowledge. Second, today, if you have a point of view, let me give you an example. I mean, they're competition to me, but this new site called Ken, it talks about the irregularities in Jabong. I mean, it got out. What a beautiful story. I mean, I hate to praise somebody else's story, but the fact is they did a story that we should. So I don't think today information flow or ideas exchange can be stifled because of ownership, because technology allows you to get to people directly. So I don't think, in my view, in fact, today is a better time for entrepreneurs than it ever was. So we'll come back to you, Raja. And so you heard the 2 gentlemen. Now you've been an entrepreneur, and then you've seen India probably better than these 2 gentlemen because they've spent time recently outside India. So what is your view?
Actually, if we see, India especially is at an interesting point of inflection. Because when we say economic prosperity, what does it really mean? Does it mean maximizing the GDP? Does it mean maximizing the returns of the shareholders? Or does it mean being exclusive, leaving the social part to the separate entity and leaving the business part to the separate entity? Right? So that is where I think we need to look, because India shining, India emerging, India brick economies, but at the same time there are a lot of social and environmental aspects which need to be looked into. So who should look into them? Government, NGOs, or something like corporates? And if we are talking about corporates, big corporates or small corporates? Because big corporates have their own inflexibility. And small corporates, do we have the ecosystem to groom them? Right? So all these questions raise a pertinent question that when we talk about economics of prosperity, has it to be exclusive? Because if it is exclusive and if it works, then it would have worked. Why India is still facing so many social and environmental challenges? So that means it works, but it doesn't work fully. There has to be something which has to be an add-on effect on that. And there comes the role of corporates. Of course, corporates do CSR, corporates do philanthropy. But then that means we do our business, but then we do something as a giving back to the society. That means we are redistributing the wealth. But then do we need to redistribute the wealth, or do we need to compete in the existing pie, or do we need to extend the business or extend the scope of the pie? So that is where I believe that corporates have a predominant role or a dominant role to create a new level of business, to create a new level of competition. So there are young corporates, there are old corporates. If you talk about HUL, Shakti project, so that is one step in the same direction. Definitely it did not change the whole dynamics of the company, but it was an effort in that direction, which was sustainable or so. Arogya Parivar, that was sustainable. But then there have been some new entities which have come over a period of time, which deserve attention. Arvind Eye Care. 30 billion patients have been treated, 3 billion surgeries have been performed, 1.5 million IOLs, intraocular lenses, are being produced by them on an annual basis at a rate of $2, right? Selco came out with the innovation of a banking solution. They decided not to sell the solar lamps in the villages. They decided to sell the complete energy solutions which are customized, which are as per the paying capacity, which have a add-on benefit of providing the after-sales support. But how to do that? An energy solution like that, which they wanted to sell somewhere, costed around 30,000 bucks. If we take into account the subsidies of the government, still it costs 15,000 bucks. Who will finance them? Government has no schemes for that. So they tied up with the rural banks, regional rural banks. They convinced them that this is not only agriculture is the priority, providing clean energy solutions is the priority. So coming out with the doorstep financing, coming out with the doorstep services and support, besides selling the product, that is how they came. So what I'm trying to make a point here is economic prosperity should not be looked only from the angle of economic. It has to be inclusive. It has to bring into the social and the environmental dimensions. And ecosystem, we cannot only depend upon the government to provide. We have to walk along with the government. We have to do our bit. We have to take risks, and we have to provide an ecosystem.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I think we'll go to the gentleman next to you.
A couple of points. One is when we talk about prosperity, what level of prosperity are we talking about? I was just discussing outside with Rajat that old article of 1932 article of Mead from London School of Economics, where he used to say that there's a choice, any society has a choice between equity and growth. So the more equitable distribution of wealth you have, the lesser is the growth that you will have. And the history of the world, I think, is a history of looking at, one generation sacrificing so that the other generation can, the next generation can prosper. And it also raises a simple, interesting question, that is the equality that we're talking about. Is that really good for growth? I mean, we've seen a little bit of it in the agriculture sector. There's some brilliant work by the JNU economist Thamra Jakshi, which says that the more fragmentation of land you have, okay, the more fragmentation of land you have, the lesser is the agricultural productivity. because the economies of scale don't step in. So I don't know. At some level, we should debate that is this equitable thing, the exclusion, the inclusion, etc., etc. Is it really sustainable over a long period of time, or is it just a short-term tactic of a government? Having said that, let me respond to my friend's points out here at two levels. One, should corporates, and since I'm from a business school, let me represent the corporates viewpoint. Should corporates actually get involved in development work, and should they work with the government, and et cetera, et cetera? A quick answer, which I'll come back to a bit later, is no. The second question is that this whole bungaloo that's been done about corporate social responsibility is the 2% mandate that's there in the company's bill. I used to be a big fan of CSR and written a lot of papers on that. But after this 1913 companies bill, I've lost interest in CSR, because what's happened is that you've converted, through a legislative framework, something which was really born out of altruism into a tax. And the companies are playing ball because it's this thing. So instead of talking about a 30% tax, they're talking about 32% tax. And the only reason why it is not being built into the tax structure is because we built into the tax structure, as you heard from Professor Debroy. It has to go through the Finance Commission. Once it goes through the Finance Commission, they lose a lot of it. So it's a lot like the cess that we pay. The cess just goes to the union government. It doesn't go to the states. So this doesn't even go to the government, but then the government has an eye on where you want to allocate these kind of resources. Couple of years ago, I was on two boards of two large public sector undertakings, and on one of the boards, I was actually the chairman of the CSR committee, which is mandated now by law. We had a budget of 80 crores. We could not, for the earth of us, find projects which merited this thing. So invariably, the budgets for 3 years used to lapse. Finally, at the end, we gave up in disgust and said, let's just dump it on the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. I'm not sure that was the kind of purpose for which this particular thing was there. We fulfilled our legal obligations. We gave the 2% and we gave it to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. And of course, it gave the PM Relief Fund a lot of additional resources. That's something that we need to think about. Again, is it sustainable? Is it not sustainable? But should the first question, that should the corporates get involved in social development and work with the government is a little bit more interesting question. And I'll go back to Michael Porter and Mark Kramer's fundamental premise of the shared value initiative. I think that's something that you guys are also working on. And the shared value is really a very, very interesting concept. And for some of you who may not be familiar with it, just do a Google search and look it up in Wikipedia, or if you have the wherewithal, just go to the Harvard website and download the article. What it says is that companies must work for the betterment of society. I'm a member of the Harvard's Microeconomics of Competitiveness, which is also Michael Porter's. In fact, Amit is also a member. And we go down to Harvard once a year and we listen to different topics and this thing. One of the things that comes out, and comes out very strongly in his article, is that he looks at two companies. He looks at McDonald's and he looks at Subway. And McDonald's makes French fries and burgers and high sodium content and fried oil, etc., etc. Subway makes sandwiches and fresh sandwiches using a lot of greens and a lot of stuff. And there's a little bit of fried thing in it also, but that's there. And you ask yourself this question, which is doing better for society? And the answer is very clear. Obviously, Subway is doing better for society, because if people eat healthy, they stay healthy. Society doesn't have to, build more hospitals and treat more patients, and insurance rates go down, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you eat McDonald's, you're likely to get blood pressure or cancer or whatever it is that is there. So this is a very, very good example of a way a shared value has to be looked at from the corporate's point of view. There has to be profit. Okay, without profit, corporates don't survive, and sustainability has to be there. And again, take you back to an article by Friedman way back in the 70s, New York Times article, which said that the only responsibility of business is to make profits. Make profits as much as you can in a legal, ethical way. Pay taxes, and let the government go about doing its work for social distribution or social justice.
So your last comment so that we can go
Yeah,
to them.
yeah. So this is really the approach that we need to look at. We're getting, sort of swept into a tide of, reforms and social inclusion, et cetera, which I don't know. As an academic, I think there's some serious problem over there, and maybe it won't be beneficial for society in the long run. Thank you.
You know, I want to bring about a point here. You know, we talk of impact ventures, ventures that contribute to the society apart from being profit making. Now, I want to ask you, who was the world's first impact entrepreneur? Or India's first impact entrepreneur? General Chopra, you've been around for a long time. Okay, yes. So I would say I give two answers, is Tatas and Mother Teresa. And they're two different kinds, right? I mean, Tatas have been doing CSR for many years. The triple bottom line, the shared value. What is Jamshedpur?
Much more than 2%.
Yes, much. So really, in the way, thanks to Dr. Kapoor, I had the good fortune of meeting Mark Kramer and doing a session with him, and I got almost killed after that for saying some things. But really, Tata's has practiced shared value for so many years without calling it shared value. Or Tata's has practiced the triple bottom line for many, many years in terms of contributing to community. Similarly, Mother Teresa. I mean, she was really serving the poor, right? But in some way, she was a social impact entrepreneur. So I think that's really, Harvard School professors have to think of new terms and new jargons to be able to sell books and sell consulting. But it's pretty much the same. Having said that, I think today there is a new normal. I think the role of governments is being redefined, the role of corporates is being redefined, the role of the NGO ecosystem is being defined, and there is a new normal which we don't know what is the right way, because some of those models haven't worked. So we'll come to him and hopefully he'll tell us the models that will work in the future and not charge us a fee for telling us.
I think this will work.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. And obviously, Legatum is a prosperity think tank, so I'm very glad to have the topic of economics of prosperity, because I direct the economics of prosperity program at the Legatum Institute. And I would point out, in your comment about Mother Teresa wasn't part of the government. So just because something needs to be done does not mean that the government has to do it. That's the first point. We look at this in terms of the individual and the individual firm. And I think we tend to have a view when we look at these issues of economics on the one hand and social issues on the other, that somehow human beings are two separate things. One is an economic man and the other is a social being. And that's not true. I mean, human beings are one integrated thing, and we're both temporal and spiritual creatures. That cannot be separated. And when we try to separate the temporal and the spiritual dimensions that we have, we end up with problems. We end up with coercive legislation that forces us to do things that we want to do anyway. And things start to break down. So in our view of economic prosperity is, and I agree, we should go beyond GDP, because it's not about, GDP can hide a lot of crony capitalism. China will have a lot of GDP. That does not mean that individual people are actually being empowered. So the way we look at this is in terms of what is the business process? The business process is individual human beings, individual firms meeting together in voluntary exchange to serve human needs. That's what it is. The issue is, what regulations and laws and distortions do you have in your market that prevent that from happening? And a lot of what Professor Rangan talked about in very specific sectors and what I talked about generally were the kinds of distortions that prevent human beings coming together to serve each other in voluntary exchange to serve human needs. Profit is merely a measure of how well you do that. That's really all it is. And if you talk to any entrepreneur that actually, a real entrepreneur, in other words, somebody whose life's work, whose mission is that service of meeting a human, not somebody who wants to create something to sell it, 2 years down the road. that person is not actually very concerned about profits and revenues and so forth. They're concerned about success. They're concerned about actually doing what they want to do. Now, they will become very profitable if they are successful. And the profit element, and this is why I agree with you that CSR, I'm very skeptical about CSR. I'm very skeptical about things like the triple bottom line, because I think at the end of the day, that metric has to be an accurate one. You have to actually measure real success. If you start confusing success with lots of other things, then it's easy for people to blur the boundaries and look successful when in fact they're not actually meeting human needs. They're doing something else, maybe something the government has ordered them to do, maybe something that the government has suggested that they should do, something like that. So we think of economic prosperity as really indivisible from all kinds of prosperity.
Very integrated.
Now, there is one aspect of economic prosperity that's incredibly important, and is an incredibly important precondition for everything else, and that is wealth creation. If you don't create wealth, you don't have anything. So now there's two kinds of wealth. Now we talked about this earlier on in the panel. There's crony capitalism and crony wealth creation. And then there is what we would call positive wealth creation, is when you actually have individual entrepreneurs who are able
We call
to
it meritocracy capitalism.
You can call it that, you can call it competitive market capitalism, you can call it anything. But what it means is that people are freed up to be the best that they can be. Now that has a social dimension. You know, when you have an individual entrepreneur like you, who is able to do what you are able to do, it creates a different mindset in the mind of the person. And if you have enough people, this is the great success of Silicon Valley, you've got enough people in a very concentrated area who all believe they can do anything. They believe they can change the world, and they have. Okay? So this is not to be confined to Silicon Valley. Every country, every region has the capability of doing that. And when we look at creating the preconditions for wealth creation, entrepreneurship, and so on, we look at investment, and we look at investors, and you know, obviously you've got foreign investors. You need to make sure that your economy is attracting foreign investors. You need to make sure your economy is creating opportunities for domestic investors. But for us, some of the most interesting investors of all are what we call nascent investors. These are people walking around with an idea in their head. Now, in an economy where there's access to capital, i.e. where the government doesn't control 70% of the banks, which is the case here, when you actually have competition in financial services, so you get the financial products that Vivek de Broy talked about earlier on.
And there's
that aren't
disruption in that
possible.
happening too.
Absolutely. You know, financial fintech companies and all kinds of things that are exploding the sort of state banking system. But have more competition in banking so that you can encourage these new methods of financial capital, so your entrepreneurs, your nascent entrepreneurs, can get the capital that they need in order to start their business. Then, flexible labor markets, why are they important for entrepreneurs? Because it's that 3 to 5 year scaling process that's when an entrepreneur actually creates jobs. They don't create a lot of jobs in the first couple of years. You know, they employ themselves, and they get going, and they get moving, and they have great ideas. But it's in that 3 to 5 year process that they create tons of jobs. And most of the jobs in the US are created by that period of small, medium-sized companies. Not the beginning. We tend to be very focused on startup when we talk about entrepreneurship. We should actually be focused on the scaling, that 3 to 5 year more process that actually will create that kind of job. To create that environment where people can be free to do positive wealth creation, to meet each other's needs, and a lot of these other things will follow. And you know, you're actually meeting needs far more successfully by allowing this voluntary exchange process to work than any amount of government paying for things will actually achieve. In the US, for example, we don't do a lot of direct aid. Overseas direct aid is very small in the US as a percentage. But there's $57 billion of private philanthropy. People, by their own choice.
So I think, you know, when I look at our country, and I'm very proud of being an Indian, I have all the wrong habits that Indians have. Marian would even attest to some of those, right? No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, just to say, you talked about the fact that it's a very individual notion. You know, there is Nitin is an expert in Indian tradition, and he went to the same business school as me and Amit. You know, in Hindu philosophy, and again, we're on the day of Guru Purnima, they say, and I'll translate it in English for those who don't, they say if you have to be really prosperous, you're successful, if you haven't, you know, let me translate it exactly. They say, Niyogi Kaya, Jeb mein Maya, Patni Paropkari, or Putra Agyakari. They say if you're really successful, and if I take that analogy to a country, they say if you're healthy, if you have wealth, as in you have money, you have a wife who is good, and you have children who listen to you, then you're really prosperous. Now that's a lot to ask for, but yes, right. But if you take that notion to a country, I think what we're talking of the health of our citizens, I think in India, we still have a long way to go in the health domain. And again, all the stakeholders have a lot of work to do. If you talk of making sure basic poverty levels are taken to a level where basic amenities, again, we have a lot to do. Third, if we talk of the two in a more social, if I take that analogy into harmony, I think we are still better than a lot of countries.
Anurag, you have 2 minutes.
I think, yeah. So I think we will get there, and I think in the BRICS that he mentioned, India is the only eye that is standing, right? So I think we'll get there. We have a prime minister who in some way wants to create this wealth for the masses and not just for the elite or a certain few. And I think in terms of philanthropy, finally some of our industrialists are waking up to it, finally. And they're doing good work. Mr. Premji is a good example of what others should emulate. So I think we'll get there. We can take some questions rather than having a monologue. So we have 4 or 5 minutes. Yes, sir. Tell us what your name is and ask a Twitter-like question.
Sort of the longest question. I'm Chandan from Yes Bank. My question is to Shankar and just stretching it.
Sorry, sir, if I offended you.
No, that's okay. So my question is on the way forward. So when you're talking about, inclusive prosperity and not treating economic prosperity as something which is exclusive of other things, we have an example of Bhutan where the measure of prosperity is happiness. And that was something which was extended to UAE, which was first for a country to have a minister of happiness. And now it's happening in Madhya Pradesh. So the measures of prosperity are being redefined. And this is something, if I can put it at a very miniature scale, for an organization, if its employees are happy, then they are more productive. So as a nation, we are becoming more productive if we are more happy. So this is something which is something new. So how do you define the way forward? Where is the exclusivity and where does the responsibility fit in of, say, measures like Human Development Index, of prosperity on the scales of SDGs, on the scale of happiness? So is it something which is just restricted to the government and government should focus on it? Or do you think that this is something which can be stretched to the corporates and they can also have a role which is beyond the 2% thing? And 2% is again something...
We got your question. Basically, we're now going to institute a ministry of weed to make everyone happy.
I mean, I think
we'll call it ministry of weed.
I think first of all, it depends what you mean by happiness. So we have to sort of define what this actually means, because that actually means different things to different people. And I would say, and at Legatum, we obviously have the Prosperity Index, so we look at a lot of different pillars of prosperity, including health and education and a lot of other things beyond sort of pure economics. But I would say, first of all, in terms of the social prosperity piece of this, and we look at this in terms of economic prosperity and social prosperity. Now, we don't divide them because of, as I said before, they're not divisible necessarily. But what we find is that in countries that are undistorted, where individuals are empowered to be the best they can be, and that's really what you mean by happiness. What you mean by happiness is what are the obstacles that prevent me from achieving what my God-given talents will allow me to achieve, and be the best that I can be, and pursue a virtuous path. That's really what happiness means. That's what the founding fathers of the United States meant when they said pursuit of happiness. They meant pursuit of virtue. So as long as nothing gets in the way of that, then your social prosperity is strong, And the countries that are undistorted tend to be the countries that have very strong social prosperity as well, which means social capital. So very high degree of trust in societies, which is the fundamental issue that brings in social prosperity. Trust between societies, bridging capital. So I trust the person I don't know, who's not in my caste, not in my tribe, not in my, I trust them. In some countries...
You trust Donald Trump?
In some I trust our institutions to be strong enough to withstand Donald Trump. And so I'll get in a car with somebody I don't know, or something. That's a high degree of trust, bridging capital. Then you also have bonding capital, which means trust within the family. Is the family unit strong? All of the things that you talked about. These are all aspects of social prosperity. But there is a very high degree of correlation between the undistorted markets, the top undistorted markets of the world, which are markets like Australia and New Zealand. The UK does actually surprisingly well in that category. Those markets are very, very trusting societies, and that's part of the happiness.
Also Bhutan is a wrong example too. I mean, it's a very small country which was closed for a long while.
It's a very poor country.
So really it's not even a country. I live in DEFCON, that's bigger than Bhutan.
I think there are more people who want to ask questions. You need to move quickly.
Yeah, there's a danger with this, which is to allow, let's focus on happiness, because we don't really want to do the things that will actually grow the economy, because they're too difficult for us to do, because the cronies control the country. And as long as the people feel happy, that's okay. Well, that's a dangerous path to go down. We think that countries need to avoid that. But I think this issue of trust is the key issue. It's for all of us. We're all human beings, and we're all vested into these aspects.
So we'll take the last question from Marian and close it. So can we get a mic to her? And
One
Mr.
question,
Kochar also
please.
wants to ask a question.
Yes, please. We are talking about, after Marian. Okay, my mic's working, so I
Marian,
can
you
talk.
may-
Okay, yeah, thank you. That was the connection I need. My name is Marian, thank you very much. I have a question for you. I want to discuss a little bit with you, it's a question, about how to manage the lack of competence, not only on the individual level, on corporate level, but also on society level. And I have a little example. You were talking about Saudi Arabia. And I was really happy to read the business plan of Saudi Arabia, 2030, 2020, and the activity plan starting right now. And I was talking and discussing the strategic objectives of the various ministries with one of the CEOs of Saudi Arabia. And I said to her, well, how are you going to manage that? She said, well, at the moment we have the companies to do the following. We give them a bucket of money, we give them some strategic options, and that's it. They have to find out what is the implementation plan and how can we manage all these changes on strategic and also on ministerial level. Now, coming back to India, I think setting up a department of skilled India is marvelous, it's fantastic. So I was discussing with the Honourable Minister, how would you define skills? He said, well, we focus on technical skills and on numbers. That's very important right now. I said, yes, but can you balance that? Not only the technical part of the definition of skills, but also the human part.
Soft skills.
Exactly, the soft skills. He said, yes, that could be interesting, but at the moment that has no priority. And I thought, well, then you transfer knowledge, you focus on a very interesting but also important part of the developing of the emerging country like India, not only the technical skills, but also the soft skills. So when,
Last 10 seconds.
Yes. So my question is how to increase that awareness, but also how to manage the lack of competence regarding the prosperity.
Shankar, can I request you to give this answer offline because we are running short of time now, so we have to close. We're already late. Wilfred, for your thing. So
Thank you. I just wanted to close, I'm not the organizer, Dr. Kapoor is, so we can do offline. But in my view, the world needs feminine leadership because, women are nurturing. And I'm saying, I've written an editorial this week. If Theresa May has become the Prime Minister of UK, and again, it's not a gender, she's competent, it doesn't matter. But I think the world needs feminine leadership, and feminine nurturing qualities to be able to create the kind of prosperity India would need to grow in future. So thank you. Please give a round of applause to our panelists. Please welcome Wilfred.
So you can just be here. Yeah, I think, ladies and gentlemen, this was a very apt sort of way to conclude the forum. The world needs women and wheat, right? So I know what you're thinking about at night, right? I mean, now, without joke, I do fully subscribe to the women part. I'm not 100% sure about the wheat part. Ladies and gentlemen, I remember a time when life was utterly boring. This is before the fall of the wall. It was simple. Right? We were either Captain America, we were Hulk, maybe Thor, but we were the good guys, and we were going after these nasty communist ogres, right? The economy in Germany at that particular point in time was doing okay, it went up. So it was, I really, literally remember, okay, listen, where's the action? Now, since then, I think what has happened is the Chinese proverb of may you live in interesting time has come to pass. Right? We have had an economic crisis, we had an EU crisis, we have terrorism, we have, for lack of a better word, populists that are rising in the US, in the UK, on a platform of inequality, on a platform of protecting their own economies, and on a platform of democracy is not working. I think that luckily in India, we're quite well prepared for these kind of confusing times, so we will be able to handle them. And I do believe that the panel and the participants today did an excellent job analyzing the implications, highlighting some of the challenges. So I would like to thank Bibek Debroy, I would like to thank Himanshu, Shankar, Rajat, Vivan, Anil, Srinivasa, Sandeep, Ajit, obviously Amit for putting everything together, and Anurag. I think it was really engaging, it was exciting, it was difficult to actually get the discussions to a close. What I believe we concluded somewhat is that free enterprise and free markets are part of the puzzle. They have to play a very important role in driving societies forward, but it's not enough. We do need a combination of enterprise and government, enterprise and society. And one of the key points is to really focus on eliminating barriers on an individual level. It's not about companies. We focused on companies as a consequence. The guys who are either owning or running these companies have become very, very rich. What we need to focus on is actually what can we bring to the constituency, which is basically at the end of the day everybody, and how do we manage that process? In the past, when I was bored, it was okay to talk about India, emerging markets. What can we do to sort of drive up economic growth, to create jobs? I remember the first time I was in India, I was quite, I loved it, right? My wife is from here, so that was one reason, but that wasn't the only one. But I remember clearly thinking, listen, how can a country great as India not create enough jobs at home? Because at that point in time, this was in 1994, I think, people were actually only focused on getting out of India. So we had a situation, a time, when going abroad, when creating jobs in India was the main issue. Today, we have a much more difficult issue to handle. It's not only the growth in India, in other emerging markets, but it's also the fact that in developed markets, the youth is getting a raw deal. Somebody just made a comment about saying the old people take cutbacks and then the youth is getting better. That's the situation over here. That's not the situation in the United States. It's not the situation in the UK. It's not the situation in Germany in many instances. So the question is, how do we eliminate constraints and how do we communicate and manage a redistribution of wealth that is only fair, has to happen, but definitely has to be managed. And I think one of the things that we've probably all come across is the appalling lack of leadership today, especially in the political domain. And I think that is an opportunity for everybody in this room to contribute to shape public opinion and as much as possible take political action. So with that, again, a big hand of applause to everybody. Thank you.